On May 5, 1917, a reporter for the New Orleans Times-Picayune managed to snag an interview with Dr. Herbert Spinden. Spinden, an archaeologist who specialized in the study of the indigenous peoples of North and Central America, was about to board a steamer bound for Guatemala. The reporter wanted to know what sort of exciting research Dr. Spinden intended to undertake during this trip. According to Spinden, he was going to study the development of primitive food recipes still in use among the native peoples of Mesoamerica. They soak their grain and from a mash produce a white liquid that has a perfect food value, he told the reporter. It made for a refreshing drink, which might prove of use to American soldiers stationed overseas. That was a lie. Not the part about the drink, which may very well have been refreshing, but about his reason for going to Guatemala in the first place. The truth of the matter was that Spinden, along with hundreds of other perfectly respectable scholars, had agreed to lend his services to the Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI. Prior to 1917, only the Secret Service and FBI felt a need for people who specialized in intelligence work. But these agencies were tasked with uncovering security threats on the home front. With the U.S. entrance into the First World War, however, the time had come for the military to train its own spies for deployment outside the borders of the United States. The most logical candidate for this task was the Navy, whose ships sailed the high seas. Yet the training of competent intelligence officers required years of training and investment. The war was now. How was the Navy going to fulfill its mandate so quickly? The answer? By recruiting scholars already in possession of many of the traits critical to intelligence work. These traits often included fluency in foreign languages, knowledge of foreign cultures and customs, cartography, navigation, mathematics, and verbal and written communication skills. Many had also served in the military or had learned how to defend themselves in the remote wilderness. All the Office of Naval Intelligence had to do was to teach them the virtues of silence and duplicity. Most were fast learners. Roy Chapman Andrews, ONI Agent Number 241, was a paleontologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. In June 1918, he was dispatched to the Far East under the scientific cover of, quote, Comparative Zoological Studies of Chinese Mammals. What he really did was submit reports about political conditions in China, communication and rail facilities, troop movements between Russian Civil War combatants in Siberia, and evidence of foreign intervention in China and Manchuria. 20 years after the war ended, Andrews was still committed to silence. In 1943, he declared that, quote, It is not permitted even now to tell what part I played in the war. Closer to home, Wilson Popenoe, ONI Agent Number 219, was dispatched to the Gulf of Mexico on the pretext of being an agricultural explorer in search of avocados that could be grown in Florida and California. Sylvanus Morley, ONI Agent Number 53, was a Mayan archaeologist with a degree from Harvard who was then working as a curator for the Peabody Museum. He not only volunteered his own services, but also provided an additional list of colleagues whom had indicated their willingness to serve. All in all, 30 intelligence agents were dispatched by the ONI to Mexico and the countries of Central America. But what sort of intelligence work could be done there? For the answer, we need only look to the so-called Zimmermann telegram. In February 1917, the British intercepted an offer by the German ambassador in Mexico of generous financial support toward any effort to retake Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico from the United States. Though never seriously considered by Mexico, the telegram was enough to prompt widespread paranoia among Washington policymakers. After all, the Germans commanded the single most destructive weapon of the war, undersea boats, or U-boats, which sunk on average 300,000 tons of shipping per month throughout the Atlantic. The Americans were well aware of the dangers of German U-boats, having lost 128 of their own citizens in the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. But that attack had occurred off the coast of Ireland, far away from the borders of North America. Now that the United States had joined the war against Germany, however, it was reasonable to expect that German U-boats would begin to set their sights closer to the American mainland. The job of Sylvanus Morley was to report on possible German U-boat base sites along the Atlantic coast of Central America. Fortunately for the ONI, many ancient Mayan ruins, the subject of Morley's peacetime research, just happened to be located within view of the coast. It did not take long, however, for Morley to determine the extreme unlikelihood of submarine docking stations being built anywhere along the shallow and turbulent waters of the Central American coastline. For example, with regard to the Mosquito Coast, Morley reported back to Washington that, quote, "All things considered, it would seem that the physical conditions of this littoral are such as to practically preclude its use by the Germans for submarine bases." Similar assessments followed nearly everywhere Morley and his colleagues traveled. "The war in Europe is so remote," Morley wrote on one occasion, "that the people here are as indifferent toward it as they are toward the ancient races I study." With the military threat debunked, Morley and his fellow spies needed something else to do. So they decided to do their best to sabotage the German economic presence in Central America. This resulted in the creation of a blacklist, on which Morley placed the names of German expatriates who worked in local factories and businesses. The most vulnerable were those employed by U.S. firms, who could be fired in accordance with the Trading with the Enemy Act. In the Mexican state of Campeche, Morley filed a report on two Germans named Adolf Raab and Gustav Walker. As both are being employed by an American firm, their discharge can easily be procured at that end if you deem the matter of sufficient importance to take it up. On another occasion, Morley passed along a list of names so that you can notify the proper people if you see fit, and thus scotch this promising little viper's nest in the embryo stage. At times, Morley feared that the viper had already left its nest. When he learned of ongoing labor strikes at 3 banana factories in Honduras, for instance, Morley rushed to investigate. As anxious as the Hun undoubtedly is to cause just such disturbances as this, Morley was forced to conclude, I think that for this once at least we may probably exonerate him from all complicity. But Morley did not stop at persecuting Germans alone. Even some U.S. citizens were targeted for reprisals. At a United Fruit factory in Honduras, Morley heard of the arrival of a young man from Milwaukee, who was said to be pro-German and fond of describing his escape from the draft. If I find out that he really is a draft dodger, I will try to have him fired just to show him that there are no hard feelings. In addition to Germans and Americans, Morley also assessed the prospects of fomenting an indigenous uprising against the local governments in the event one of those governments should, quote, force our hand by allying herself with Germany and declaring war on us. The situation on the Yucatan Peninsula seemed most promising to Morley, who believed that, quote, with any sort of encouragement from us, the Yucatecans would throw off the Mexican yoke, separate themselves from the rest of the republic, and declare themselves an independent state. What form would such U.S. encouragement take? A gunboat at Campeche, another at Progreso to prevent the Mexicans from sending any reinforcements over here, Morley explained, and the Yucatecans themselves could easily take care of the 1,000-odd Mexican soldiers now maintained here. All in all, Sylvanus Morley covered just under 2,000 miles and 13 months of intelligence work, having traversed both the coastlines and interiors of Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. After the war, he transitioned seamlessly right back into the academic career he had put on hold 2 years prior. Morley saw no conflict of interest between the two, but others did. In December 1919, The Nation published a letter to the editor by Franz Boas, then considered the most famous anthropologist in America and now viewed as the father of the discipline. In his letter to The Nation, Boas claimed that Morley and his colleagues had committed the ultimate betrayal. A person who uses science as a cover for political spying, who demeans himself to pose before a foreign government as an investigator, and asks for assistance in his alleged researches in order to carry on, under this cloak, his political machinations, he wrote, prostitutes science in an unpardonable way and forfeits the right to be classed as a scientist. Boas was a man ahead of his time. Though his critique would eventually win the day, Boas would not live to see his victory. On the contrary, Just 10 days later, at the annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association, that organization's governing council voted to censure Boas and remove him from its ranks. Not only that, he was also forced to resign his position on the National Research Council and openly denounced as a Hun in bed with the Germans. This cozy relationship between scholars and government continued during the Second World War. Though most stayed well behind the battle lines and were often limited to producing a trail of paperwork, they nonetheless provided valuable translations of foreign news reports, interviews with refugees, and first-hand knowledge of distant lands and peoples. But change was in the air. The critique of Franz Boas, who declared that scholars who went to war could no longer be considered scholars, was gaining more traction than ever before. The unprecedented destruction of 2 world wars, the specter of nuclear warfare, and revelations of unimaginable human cruelty such as the Holocaust could all be traced back to the supposedly neutral application of scientific ideas in one form or another. Perhaps most importantly, the U.S. government itself was fast outgrowing its long-standing dependence on temporary contract labor to fulfill the demands of intelligence work throughout the world. This last point is best illustrated by the creation in 1941 of the Office of the Coordinator of Information and its institutional successors, the Office of Strategic Services, and finally, the Central Intelligence Agency. It is no coincidence that the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, has always been referred to by its employees as the campus, for that was exactly what the creation of the CIA represented. An in-house training campus for government agents who would combine the area studies knowledge of previously contracted university scholars with the technical and martial know-how of a professional spy. In the end, Franz Boas won the day. Today, scholars may consult for the U.S. government, but they do not undertake the work of a spy unless they are willing to turn their backs on academia for good. What happens, however, when there is no cry of dissent from someone like Boas? In the absence of a moral critique, how far can a political ideology infuse the work of scholars? For the answer, please join us next time as we explore Nazis and Jews in episode 20 of Indiana Jones in History.